Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. Okay, so I have with me Professor Jim Slagle from the University of Portland, and I'm here to discuss his idea of the Epistemological Skyhook. So, Jim wrote this book, The Epistemological Skyhook, it was released in 2016, right?
It was just last year, yeah.
Yeah. And this book, I found this book actually just doing a Google search on certain key terms for this problem in epistemology that I was interested in. And your book is pretty much the only book that I found that comprehensively addressed this argument that seems to me to be such a fundamental argument in epistemology. So that's what I want to talk to you about here. So let's kind of just start with the basics.
Okay.
What is this argument? What is the epistemological skyhook?
Well, it can be addressed towards determinism or naturalism or both. The idea is that these positions are self-defeating. So with regards to determinism, if we grant that determinism is true, then that would mean all of your mental functions are determined by processes that can be traced back before you were born, before you had any rationality, certainly before the rational process of thinking through your beliefs. But if that's the case, then your belief in determinism is determined in that way. And if your belief in determinism is determined by non-rational forces, then, so the argument goes, there's something wrong. It seems to be self-referentially incoherent. You don't believe it because it's true. You believe it because you just can't help it.
Okay. So let me try to draw that out a little bit. Why is the fact that our belief in determinism is itself determined, why does that necessarily undermine it?
It depends on what the determining forces are. I mean, if you had a determinism where you're determined by like the laws of logic, so that your beliefs, you can't help but think logically, then it wouldn't be a problem. But if they're determined by physical forces, then ultimately, if those physical forces were aligned with mental processes that led to false beliefs, you'd believe the false beliefs. So it's not that you're weighing the reasons for your beliefs. It seems like you are, but it's all determined beforehand. And you don't have the ability to follow the evidence where it leads or something like that. Now, I'm stating it really roughly. In fact, I think in the first chapter, this is close to the way I state it in the first chapter. And I say, as it stands, this argument plainly fails. Mm-hmm. This way, it has to be treated more delicately to make it actually work. And there are, I say also in the book, that there are escape routes that are available to the determinist that aren't necessarily available to the naturalist. So I prefer to have it as an argument against naturalism rather than determinism.
Okay, so let's follow that then. Before getting into the naturalist version, let's actually first be clear about what is naturalism.
That's really hard. Nobody's going to agree on the definition of this, you know? I mean, what people usually mean is anti-supernaturalism, but that leads to this circle where you don't really find the original idea that's being referenced, you know? Supernaturalism means something more than nature. Anti-supernaturalism is just a negation of that. So I think it's very difficult to get a good definition of naturalism. I mean, what Plantinga does, and I think this is probably wise, is he just says it entails the non-existence of God or anything non-physical.
Okay, so it entails that God doesn't exist and that nothing that isn't physical exists.
Right.
So let's try to tease that out for just a moment. Does that necessarily mean that if you're a naturalist, you're not going to believe in something like, abstract objects? Or is that a sort of a different question?
You could, but I'm not sure if you'd be a naturalist. I mean, you'd be something, I guess it's going to depend. I mean, like I say, the reason you can't define naturalism is because if you address one person's version, the next person you meet is going to have a different idea of what it means. you have people like C.D. Broad, for example, who seems to have been an atheist, but thought that there was a non-physical realm of reality. I mean, you can be an atheistic Platonist, for example, right? That's a possible route to take.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, then but then an atheist Platonist, I think, would not be a naturalist, because you're saying that the central reality, the more real reality, is the non-physical reality.
I think in your book, you sort of, I think there was a section where you laid out a kind of trajectory where it used to be called materialism, and then people started calling it physicalism, and then at some point people started calling it naturalism.
Right.
I think that maybe helps to at least to try to pin down at least what it's trying to get at, right? It's trying to get at a worldview where all that exists is the physical world. And then, where you draw some of the lines about what can count and what can't count is maybe a little blurry, but that's the basic idea. It's just the physical world that sort of physics tells us about is basically the only thing that exists.
Right. That's a good way of putting it. I mean, it's not necessarily, I mean, what qualifies as being part of the natural world is debatable, but that you can't go beyond it is kind of the core idea there.
Okay. So then, so what is the Naturalism Skyhook then?
The anti-naturalism skyhook would be something along the lines of saying if naturalism is true, then all of our brain processes are the product of cause and effect naturalistic forces. But cause and effect naturalistic forces can produce false beliefs just as easily as true beliefs. I mean, false beliefs are caused just as much as true beliefs are caused. And if the only causal relation we can appeal to is just brute cause and effect, we have no way of distinguishing truth from falsity, true beliefs from false beliefs. But then, of course, that would apply to our belief in naturalism itself. So it's self-undermining in that regard.
So would you
stating it really, really brutally here? I'm not saying that the way I'm stating it right now will I mean, the way I stated at the end of the book is like this more extravagant way of putting it, but it has to do with a lot more with epistemology, because a lot of people take this argument and just apply it really simply, and that might be part of the reason why some people think this argument is too simple, too easy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so but in the naturalism version, then the thing to take away from it is that there's got to be something else going on as far as our mental processes, other than just physical stuff moving around,
right?
In order for us to feel like we should be able to trust those mental processes. Would you say that that's basically right? That's
a good way of putting it. I mean, Richard Taylor has something that approaches an epistemological skyhook when he gives the example of a train going through the British countryside, and someone looks out the window and sees "British Rail welcomes you to Wales" written on the side of a hill in white rocks. And he says, well, unless that's there on purpose, if it was just natural processes that just bleached those rocks and they rolled down the hill into that configuration by chance, if that's the case, then you wouldn't trust what it seems to be saying. And so that's similar to the idea here. If it's just the natural processes, then there's something incongruent with us trusting what they seem to be telling us.
And then it gets self-referential, because what happens then is that you can't trust the very process that got you to think that you should believe naturalism in the first place, or that you should believe determinism in the first place.
Right.
Okay. While we're on this, what would you say is the difference between the determinism version and the naturalism version? They sound, I think at first glance they seem to be very similar. They seem to be almost the same argument. What would you say is the main distinguishing factor?
The distinguishing factor really is what you're arguing for. If you're focusing on the determinism part, then you're going to be arguing for something. I don't know if it would have to be libertarian free will, but it would be some kind of free will. It would at least be against hard determinism. And if you're arguing against the naturalist version of it, then you're saying there's got to be something more than the natural world. So the determinist argument you'll often see in texts on ethics to try to establish we have free will and so ethics is possible. And the anti-naturalist view you'll often see in texts in philosophy of religion. So it's just it's funny how that works. Now I think the anti-determinist is not it doesn't necessarily address the possibility of externalist epistemology, much less naturalized epistemology. I think those possibilities could give an answer to the anti-determinist form of the skyhook, but I don't think that's an option available to the anti-naturalist view.
Can you say more about that? What is externalist epistemology or naturalized epistemology, and in what way do they escape one version of the skyhook but not another?
Right. Well, the internal-external divide in epistemology, and it's not a binary thing. It's a scale, more or less internal or external. And by internal, it roughly means information that's internally accessible to the individual. And so, for example, like the laws of logic. Well, I'm not the source of the laws of logic, but they're internally available to me. So they're relevantly internal. But if something like the specifics of my brain chemistry, well, in a sense, that's internal to my brain, but it's not internal to my understanding. So that would be considered an external factor. And the internalist-externalist divide is basically how much of our knowledge has to be internally available in order to be knowledge, and how much of it can just be externally available. A shorthand of the difference is that the internalist will say that you have to know that you know something in order to know it, and the externalist would deny that. So you have Michael Bergman's book a few years ago, Justification Without Awareness. Mm-hmm. That's a defense of externalism. And with the epistemological skyhook, the problem comes in when you start looking at justification and how do you justify your beliefs, and you justify them by applying reason to them in an internalist sense. With externalism, if you don't have to defend your beliefs, because if they're justified without you being aware that they're justified, they just count as knowledge. So you don't have to find some reason to believe them before they become rational.
Sounds then like the externalist account of knowledge is divorcing knowledge to some extent from the process of reasoning through something. Would you say that that's right?
Yeah, but like I say, of course they affirm reason. The question is just whether, because most of our beliefs that we would consider knowledge, I couldn't give you a reason for my belief that I had cornflakes for breakfast, a lot of our beliefs are like this. We don't have an internalist reason for, but that doesn't mean that they're irrational. In fact, quite the opposite. If I said I'm not going to believe I had cornflakes until I can think of a reason justifying that belief, that would be an irrational move on my part. I just remember having the cornflakes, and that's enough.
So would you say then that the externalist account is something like you get information either through sensory data or through memory or things of that nature, and then you never question it, you hardly even notice that you got this knowledge, you just have it. And so you don't have to go through some process of analyzing it or being aware of the fact that you have it. You just have it, and it didn't really have to do with reasoning through it. Is that more or less right?
Yeah, but it's not but again, it's not a universal claim. They don't deny reasoning. They just don't say that it has to always be the case for something to be rational and knowledge that it be reasoned to.
Right. So it's not necessarily that all knowledge is like that, but you can have some knowledge that's like that.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So let's get back to then how this applies to the determinist skyhook.
Okay. Well, the determinist, I think, in response to the epistemological skyhook, could say, sure, I'm determined and I have these beliefs, but that in itself doesn't give me a reason to deny that the beliefs are valid. Just because they're determined, so what? In a sense, you want your beliefs to be determined by the right things, right? Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you're just saying that they spontaneously pop into your head, which is not a good source for knowledge generally. So by itself, they would say that if you go with the externalist standpoint and determinism, you can potentially avoid the epistemological skyhook. Now, I think you could strengthen it, the skyhook, so that you can say it gives you a reason to have to question these beliefs. But that's a further step that you would have to take with the determinist argument that I don't think you have to take with the naturalistic argument.
Okay. And why, so why can't the naturalist say something analogous to what the determinist says? What's the difference here that makes the naturalist not vulnerable to the externalist sort of counter?
Because the naturalist, when you present the argument, the determinist has the ability to appeal to, I think, something like, I guess what's sometimes called soft determinism or compatibilism. And that would be sufficient to get them through. With the anti-naturalist form of the argument, you can say that our beliefs coincide with what a rational agent would believe, that the natural processes are not in place to bring us to true beliefs, but they coincide with what an actual rational agent would be. But that's just to affirm that you're not a rational agent. So if that's the case, then you're just out of luck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like the skyhook is going to block any kind, and the ability to trust any kind of reasoning. And like you said, the externalist can only go so far. The externalist can say that some knowledge is like that, but he's not going to be able to say that all knowledge is independent of reason.
Yeah, I think that's right. And yeah, that's right, that the skyhook does kind of block that. It goes down to the core of it and says, and challenges virtually all beliefs that you form. But having said that, it also provides a way out to avoid that drastic conclusion. And you can even rephrase it. I mean, Alvin Plantinga, in his version of this argument, he says if you don't like challenging basic logical and mathematical beliefs, feel free to just say that what this skyhook argument calls into question is our ability to form reliable metaphysical beliefs. But then that would apply to naturalism, because naturalism is a metaphysical belief.
So he's sort of giving some wiggle room for somebody who might insist that you can still be sure about 2 + 2 = 4 or what have you.
Right. And he's not really doing it to because he recognizes a problem there. He just thinks that when someone says 2 + 2 = 4 and you challenge it, they're not going to take you seriously. So it's just to maybe give a little grace to make the argument more palatable. Right.
It's the argument can be a little weaker and still fly and do everything it's supposed to do. So why not catch more people in the trap of the argument?
Yeah.
So it sounds like this is fundamentally an argument that works by taking you through a total skepticism, right?
Yeah.
The way that it works is by passing you through that.
Yeah, it seems. Yeah, either that's the conclusion or that's the method. Yeah, that's
okay.
Right.
Yeah. What about the fact that the argument is seems to be self-referential? So it you only get to the troublesome part. Like you seem like you're on okay ground the whole way through until the part where the skepticism that it gives you gets put back on the belief that got you there in the first place, and now you're in a sort of loop that you can't get out of, and now you can't trust anything, including how you got here in the first place. So talk a bit about that,
right.
About that self-referential loop. To what extent do you think that self-reference is really crucial here? Because obviously in philosophy, there's a lot of problems that seem to arise with self-reference. Do you think that self-referential aspect is important?
I think so. I mean, at least with the epistemological skyhook, the self-reference is what makes it interesting, So I think that's, I mean, if you just say naturalism is false because if you said, for example, that naturalism can't account for belief content. There are beliefs actually having propositional content. Well, that's an interesting claim. But then if you apply it to belief in naturalism itself, it gets more interesting. You have to be careful because if you jump ahead, you can just make anything self-defeating. So you have to establish really that naturalism actually has this conclusion, and then it actually establishes that problem for itself. So you have to tread lightly. Mm-hmm. But I think it can be done, at least in some regard. With regards to the Humean loop, yeah, it's very Humean that you have this argument that leads you to a skeptical conclusion, but then the skeptical conclusion would negate the argument. And if it negates the argument, then you no longer have a reason to accept the skeptical conclusion, in which case you can trust your reason, which then leads you into the skeptical conclusion again. Mm-hmm. And Hume said, when you see this coming, go out and play backgammon with your friends because you're not going to be able to resolve this. But the best way if you see something like this circle of defeat, of unresolvable defeat, not undefeatable defeat like Plantinga claims, but unresolvable or irresoluble defeat.
Hey Jim, I lost you for a moment. Can you say that again about the irresoluble defeat?
Yeah, when you see a situation of irresoluble defeat like this, and you can see how it's going to work, that you have a reason for skepticism that takes away your reason, then that takes away your skepticism, then that allows you to apply reason to the skepticism again. When you see that situation coming, the rational thing to do is to do what you can to avoid it. If believing in naturalism leads to that, then you should avoid it. I mean, I'll give you a parallel though too. I mean, if you say, I think I even mentioned this in the book, if you think theism leads to something like the evil genie scenario, Descartes' evil genie, right? Well, if you think that it leads to that evil genie scenario, you should be skeptical about everything you have, everything you believe, but that includes theism and then the evil genie scenario, which takes away your skepticism, but then that brings you back to theism and brings you back to the evil genie scenario. If that's the case, you should reject theism to avoid the evil genie scenario.
So there's a couple of things I want to ask about this. So first of all, I was talking about self-reference, and it strikes me how similar this is to some of the paradoxes of self-reference that people talk about, like the liar paradox and Russell's and all that, right? Yeah. To give the easiest analogy, I think if you look at the liar paradox and the way it leads you to this, well, if it's true, then it's false, and if it's false, then it's true, and it lands you on a kind of loop.
I love those. I can't stop thinking about those.
Yeah, me too. And it strikes me that it strikes me as very interesting to see this sort of show up somewhere else, this same kind of structure.
Right. The Skyhook is weaker than those because like the problem with the liar paradox, there's just no possible world with it. Or Russell's paradox, the set of sets that don't belong to themselves. There's no possible world where you can have a set of sets that don't belong to themselves. So it's a logical, so that's self-refuting. And with naturalism, determinism, the claim is much weaker. It's not saying that it's self-refuting. There are logically possible worlds that are determined or are naturalistic. That's very possible. What's the problem is rationally believing determinism or rationally believing naturalism, because in order to rationally believe those claims, then according to the argument, you don't live in one of those naturalistic or deterministic universes. So it's self-defeating, but it's not a contradiction like Russell's paradox is. So it's weaker.
Right. It doesn't. The situation that the argument takes you to is a very possible situation. It just happens to be one that you can't coherently believe.
Right. It's like the way I tend to think of it is like, just assume everything you will ever say is granted that I have the possibility of being rational, then, and say whatever you want. And if anything you want has the conclusion that you're not rational, then then that's a problem, because you can only get to that possibility by granting that you are rational.
Right. So you talked a little bit about this Humean loop in this paper that you wrote about Plantinga's version. So
Right.
actually, I want to dive a little bit into Plantinga's version. Tell me a little bit about what is Plantinga's version of the Skyhook in particular? Why do you find it to be of particular interest?
Partially because Plantinga it has a lot of ink spilled on it. I mean, a lot of critics of it. So there's you're able to go deeper into it just by virtue of the attention it's received. And Plantinga is very interesting because his starting point for all of his philosophy is he does not like theistic arguments. That's his first book was God and Other Minds, where he argued that none of the theistic arguments are compelling, but then none of the arguments for the existence of other minds is compelling either. And he puts them on the same category like that. And if there were a compelling theistic argument, Plantinga would be discomfited by that, because his religious epistemology does not really leave room for that. So he's coming at it from that angle.
So this is very interesting. So let me just say for people who don't know who we're talking about, Alvin Plantinga is a contemporary philosopher. I think he's still around.
Yeah, he's in his 80s.
And he was he's done a lot of stuff, right? He was fairly influential in the development of like modal logic and possible world semantics, and that kind of revolution that happened in the second half of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And he's also, probably what he's most known for is that he is an analytic philosopher who works in logic and epistemology and is an outspoken Christian.
Right.
So it's very interesting, he's a very interesting figure because when we start talking about him and the first thing you say is he doesn't like theistic arguments.
Yeah.
It's interesting to put that in that context. So, So keep going about that. About why did you say that his epistemology doesn't leave room for theistic arguments?
Well, because he calls it reformed epistemology, and he thinks that if you could prove, like with a mathematical logical proof that God exists, then he thinks I might be mistaken, but I think he says there'd be no room for faith then. And part of the idea is that there has to be he thinks there has to be a gap. So if you had such an argument, it would be problematic for him. Having said that, he holds those arguments to a very high standard. In his first book, God and Other Minds, he says that he argues that none of the theistic arguments really establish with absolute certainty that God exists, and none of the atheistic arguments establish with certainty that God doesn't exist. So that's the position he's coming at. He wants to leave room for faith to do its work, I guess. And he comes at this. He's a naturalized epistemologist, which is, mystery under mystery. That this outspoken Christian theist would adopt naturalized epistemology.
So say more about that. Earlier, we dove into externalist epistemology. What is naturalized epistemology in particular? Naturalized epistemology is associated especially with Quine and his attempt to just his goal, Quine's goal, was to make epistemology a category of psychology, or maybe even just reduce it to psychology. Once you've explained the input of sensory impressions with the output of speaking, or more specifically scientific theories, that's all you have to explain. There's nothing more to explain. Like justification, whether it's an appropriate belief that you have, whether it's an appropriate scientific,
That's irrelevant for epistemology. And that was his initial statement of it. And it was pretty extreme because of that. And there are plenty of naturalized epistemologists who don't go the whole way. They'll say, yeah, we still have normativity. We still have a justification or warrant aspect of knowledge, but you can't separate that completely from how we should form beliefs can't be separated from how we do form beliefs.
Okay,
but,
so let me see.
Yeah, sorry.
So let me see if I understand, at least the first basic Quinean version. It's that we want to be able to explain the phenomenon of knowledge, let's say, through simply naturalistic description, right?
Right.
So here's the question then. How does Plantinga, how does he manage to square having a naturalized epistemology with having the Skyhook argument?
Yeah, it's really that's why he's so interesting. He basically says, and I might even be able to quote him, naturalized epistemology can only flourish in the garden of supernatural metaphysics. That's what he says. The idea is that Quine says we should just base our theories of knowledge, of how we come to our beliefs, on the scientific study of how we form those beliefs in response to sensory impressions. And he says we should base that on the hard sciences, like descriptive psychology, things like this. And Plantinga points out, yeah, but descriptive psychology is also prescriptive. Just calling it descriptive psychology, it already has prescriptions. There's normativity all throughout the sciences. Not in the harder sciences like physics and probably not chemistry. I think Leibniz argued that there were in chemistry. But in biology and anything above that, like sociology and anthropology and all this, or just medicine, you have norms. This is what this organ or structure is supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And since that's Quine's starting point, Plantinga just points out Quine was already starting with norms. So it's never going to be like a pure naturalized epistemology, only describing with no prescribing, because what Quine's appealing to has prescriptions built into it. And so then he just says, okay, so unless we have a reason to deny that things are what they seem to be, then we can just accept the beliefs as they come to us. So beliefs are innocent. This is very externalistic and naturalized. Beliefs are innocent until proven guilty. And so from that, he has this supernatural naturalized epistemology, where he applies naturalized epistemology to religious epistemology. And he says, I don't have to defend belief in God unless you give me a reason to think my belief in God is not veridical. And he's been shouting this in the halls of academic philosophy for half a century, and he still says, no one's given me a good reason to question my belief in God. Now, he's gone into great detail. I mean, when he first started shouting this, they threw the logical problem of evil at him. And he pretty much refuted the logical problem of evil. That's not really defended anymore. I see philosophers who say they still accept it, but I don't see any of them defending it in print anymore. Wow. And according to Plantinga and Van Inwagen, that's not really where the problem of evil lies. They say the problem of evil is the argument against the existence of God from evil tends to come from a probabilistic argument from evil now, instead of a logical problem.
Okay, so let's go into that for a moment. What is the problem of, this is a bit of a digression, but it's interesting. What is the problem of evil, and how did Plantinga what is the logical problem of evil, and how did Plantinga shoot it down?
Well, the problem of evil, just roughly, I mean, that's the biggest family of atheistic arguments, and it's just that the existence of evil is incompatible with the existence of God. You got to pick one or the other. And the logical problem says
I guess presumably because part of what defines God is that he is all loving, all good,
Right.
So why would there wouldn't be evil if there were such a thing as a God?
Right. Right. God, if God is omnibenevolent, that's more of a theological term, but omnibenevolent, right? And if he's omnipotent, then he would want us to experience only the good, and he would be able to make that happen. But that's not what happens. So either God lacks, I think this goes back to Epicurus, either God lacks goodness or he lacks power or both, because he just doesn't exist. And the logical problem of evil says there is a strict logical contradiction between the statement God exists and evil exists. And I couldn't tell you how he refuted it, because he has a little book called God, Freedom, and Evil, and he goes into a few other things, but that book is essentially like a 120-page syllogism. So I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to summarize that for you off the top of my head right now.
Gotcha.
But it's just fascinating how he goes into it. And that's actually, I think he goes into it quite a bit in his book, The Nature of Necessity, as well.
Okay.
But that's the logical. Now, the probabilistic argument from evil is that evil is not logically incompatible, but it makes it less probable that God exists. And that has a lot more punch to it in that regard. One of the ways that's argued is that it's gratuitous evil. There seems to be a lot of gratuitous evil. I mean, evil that has no redeeming qualities to it. It's just there. And like the evil that animals suffer in a forest fire before the advent of man, right? They suffered and they died and it was horrible. How do you explain that if there's an all-loving, all-powerful God? So you still have these interesting points. I mean, it's probably 90% of the arguments, atheistic arguments, are variations on arguments from evil.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So let's get back on track then. What is Plantinga's Skyhook?
His Skyhook is that given naturalistic evolution, he ties naturalism and evolution together. Given naturalism and evolution, the probability that we would have reliable cognitive faculties, and by that he means that our faculties produce true beliefs most of the time, like 2/3, 3/4 of the time, something like that. The probability would be low. And if the probability is low, then it actually produces a defeater for the belief that our cognitive faculties are reliable.
And what is that? What is a defeater?
A defeater is a reason to withhold belief. That's what a defeater is. It's not necessarily a reason to disbelieve. It could just be a reason to withhold belief. So you could be agnostic about something. But it doesn't necessarily give you a reason to think that your cognitive faculties are not reliable, but it gives you a reason to withhold belief that they are. So if you have a defeater for that belief that your cognitive faculties are reliable, then you would also have a defeater for any belief that you think is produced by your cognitive faculties. But of course, all of our beliefs are produced by our cognitive faculties, including belief in naturalistic evolution. So if naturalistic evolution is true, you have a defeater for belief in naturalistic evolution, which is a problem.
Right. Okay. So then we see right there that there's the Skyhook circle again.
Right.
There's a part of it that is interesting, given what we've talked about, externalist and naturalized epistemology. Mm-hmm. What it's calling the thing that has the defeater are our cognitive faculties.
Right.
And I guess it depends on what we mean by cognitive faculties, but under a naturalized externalist view of knowledge, mm-hmm. are there maybe some things that we know that we don't know through our cognitive faculties, but through something else? Or are we thinking of cognitive faculties?
Some people have tried to defend that. Some people have tried to defend that. I mean, Paul Churchland wrote an essay defending that, suggesting that he actually went further. He said, yes, each individual does, he follows the argument, each individual does have a defeater for the belief that their cognitive faculties are reliable. But when we pool them all together, and as a scientific community, those false beliefs are weeded out. And I don't think he can do. I don't think that move is available to him. But a cognitive, the way Plantinga means, I mean, since we're dealing with his argument, you got to go with his definition of cognitive faculties. And so any belief is going to be at least go through the gatekeeper of our cognitive faculties. So by his definitions, if our cognitive faculties are not reliable, then we're not going to have any belief that is reliably formed.
Okay. So by cognitive faculty, we're not just meaning the reasoning process, but we're actually mean any and all processes by which we attain knowledge.
Right. Well, he would say that the belief forming attributes of our minds, whatever you want to call that.
Okay. And so the reason for this then, and I take it that this is where most people have tried to object, is that evolution isn't going to select for truth, right? So can you say a bit about that? I imagine that some people might want to quibble with that and say, well, you know, maybe evolution would select for truth, or well, we assume evolution selects for, I don't know, you know, for survival and reproduction and survival of the species, right? But you know, maybe that actually corresponds to truth.
Right. Some people do not see any strength in that objection. I think there's some strength to it, but it's not strong enough to avoid the skyhook. But some people just say, yeah. So if all that would be selected for is beliefs or belief-forming processes that form useful beliefs, not true beliefs. But some critics have said, okay, give us an example of a cognitive system that has these not true beliefs but would have survived. And it's very difficult to come up with that. I mean, you can't, in fact, difficult. We can't do it. You might be able to program a computer to do it. I don't know. But you can't really do it. Planning what's around us.
If you're an animal, right? If you're an animal going through the process of evolution, and you have a developing belief-forming mechanism, if there's a tiger coming after you,
right?
Evolution will probably select for you having the belief there's a tiger coming after me. And so there's a sense in which there's some intuitive bite to the idea that we should expect evolution to select for true beliefs, even if it's not exactly directly truth that it's selecting for.
Right. No, but what Plantinga points out is that evolution would select for beliefs that get the body to do the right thing. And you can come up with any number of beliefs that would have identical effects. And just because he's planning it and he's got a Plantinga himself, he comes up with all these crazy examples, like this hominid thinks he's going to take part in a 10-kilometer race and that the appearance of a saber-toothed tiger is the starting signal. Or, you know, he's decided to cut down he decided he's going to lose weight, so every time he sees tasty foods, he's going to run away, and he mistakenly thinks that the tiger is a big slab of bacon. I don't know. Just things like this, crazy things like this. All of these kinds of beliefs would have the same effect as true beliefs would. So there's too much leeway here to nail it down and say that it would tend to be true beliefs. But this is exactly where, in response, some of his critics, this is the first version of his argument, which is developed. He's on his third version of this argument now. And his critics have said that, sure, you can have one false belief like that, but then that false belief would have detrimental effects elsewhere in his life, and so it wouldn't be survivable. You have to have this system. And so what Plantinga does very cleverly is he takes basically the system of beliefs we have and then piggybacks on it by just inserting a false belief that touches all other beliefs. So he says this group of people thinks everything is a witch. So they say the witch cloud is blocking out, or the witch cloud is blocking out the witch sun today. something like that. Okay, well, since there aren't any witches, all of their beliefs would be false. And that works. Technically, that would make all of their beliefs false, but for a lot of people, they'd say, it's still truth tracking, though. That's not enough. Part of the issue here is whether, Thomas Nagel put it really well. Certain beliefs, like elementary logic and mathematical beliefs, it's very difficult to see how we could have false beliefs at that level and survive them. But then Nagel says but our speculations about the universe, about metaphysical reality, about knowledge, all these things go so far beyond that level that the trust we have at that ground level of logical and mathematical beliefs cannot be extended to our knowledge about the physical world as revealed to us by science and metaphysical truths that other minds exist and things like this. And I don't feel that as strongly as Nagel does. I think there's pretty strong continuity there. So that's a problem for me that I have to resolve. But Nagel and Plantinga and lots of others who like this argument think that it's very easy to just divorce the really obvious beliefs from metaphysical speculations.
There's also, what about just the idea that even if there are many beliefs that would still cause the body to do the right thing, mm-hmm. That maybe, assuming that evolution follows a kind of, roughly a kind mm-hmm. of path of least resistance type of process, mm-hmm. that that the easiest or most reasonable thing to expect is that selecting for what ends up being truth will just be the easiest or most likely way that it would happen, that evolution would select for the body doing the right thing.
Yeah, I guess the objection at that point would be like, for Plantinga, he makes the distinction between indicative representations and depictive representations. And an indicative representation, it just indicates something about an organism or its environment. Smoke indicates fire. A depictive representation has depictive content, propositional content. So beliefs, as Plantinga defines them, are depictive representations. Evolution would definitely see indicative representations and select the more accurate ones, but it wouldn't see the depictive content if it happened to arise. The question is, why is this? Why would we assume that there's a dichotomy? If content arises, why wouldn't it be about roughly the same thing? And an analogy that I would give is be like a singer who sings at just that right tone to make a wine glass shatter, right? Well, someone could say, what was the word she was singing? Was she singing the word shatter or break or something like that? I was like, no, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the word she was singing was. It's like, but why should we assume there's a dichotomy? Couldn't we assume that it's by virtue of the fact that she's singing the word shatter that the glass shatters? It's like, well, there's no reason to think that. That seems like magical thinking. And I think Plantinga appeals that. I think he even says magical thinking in a couple of places, that thinking that if content arose, it would just happen to be corresponding to what the indicator indicates. It would be a massive coincidence. I quote C.S. Lewis in the book as this great little passage where he just says, it would be like if I knocked out the ashes in my pipe and the ashes arranged themselves into letters that read, "We are the ashes of a knocked out pipe." So unless we have some connection there, and the problem with getting a connection there is this is essentially the mind-body problem. In order to avoid the epistemological skyhook, you've got to solve the mind-body problem.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of the general problem of identifying what we mean by saying that that we have the truth about the facts about reality, when presumably there's a sense, at least a sense, in which reality is always filtered through either our perception or through our cognitive faculties.
Right. Locke's primary and secondary qualities kind of things. Yeah, that's true. I mean, we can't get outside of ourselves to see what reality is like apart from how it appears to us. Yeah, that's right. That's why some people kind of attribute this epistemological skyhook argument to Kant. They'll say that Kant had a version of this argument, and that makes sense with Kant because he's got this, the way things appear to us, but that's not the Ding an sich, the thing in itself.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes sense.
It's kind of like it reminds me a bit of that kind of question. I think there's an internet meme about this question, which is that moment when you think, whoa, what if the blue that I see is not the blue that somebody else sees?
Yeah.
Whoa. And, in a way that can be a very, you get that feeling of like, whoa, right? But then at the same time, you also realize that it's almost a meaningless question.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's sort of forgetting that there is already that filtering process going through in everybody's individual perception. So there is no such thing as actual blue, let's say, right?
Yeah.
And so in a sense, I think what I'm trying to get at is there such a thing as the truth beyond the kind of truth that we're talking about when we're talking about Plantinga's argument? So, when we say, for example, let me see if I can articulate this. When we say Plantinga says, maybe when a tiger is coming after you, what you think is, I got to lose weight, and there's a piece of bacon.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, if you always think that, and that actually coheres with the rest of your beliefs in such a way that you can actually move around and survive and have conversations with other people.
Right. Is there a difference?
Then what is the actual truth of the fact that, no, it's actually a tiger there? What does that consist of? Because a tiger is is what we call a natural kind, but it was a natural kind identified and named by people, right?
Yeah.
That have these cognitive faculties that we all share. So what would the truth consist of that's the truth that we're missing? Right.
I don't know. I've always had, maybe this just shows that I was bound to be a philosopher, but I've always liked that issue about whether other people see things differently than you, whether other minds exist, stuff like this. I went through a period in high school where I strongly suspected other minds didn't exist. I wouldn't have bet on it or anything, but, I suspected it. And with asking whether someone else experiences blue the same way we do, I think you can maybe this is passing it off, but I think you can make some sense of it because you're asking, if I were in their mind, what would I see as blue, and compare that with what I see as blue. So you're trying to, and maybe that's an incoherent concept, getting into someone else's mind like that. But it doesn't strike me as incoherent. So that in itself, I don't think it's an incoherent question. I think it's just one that you can't find out, really.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think you're right about that. I can imagine, putting myself in somebody else's mind, and then suddenly everything that right now looks blue to me actually looks green. The colors were inverted. That is conceivable. So
it's conceivable. Now, with what you're saying, that's a really interesting point you're raising. I mean, what if it just is truth like that? And truth and meaning, I think, are mutually interrelated concepts. So I don't think you can separate truth from meaning. And I don't think you can separate meaning and make it like blue. I don't think you can make it a secondary quality. Although it's, I mean, boy, you raised a really interesting question there. I think for Plantinga, he would say if the belief has propositional content, then it's that propositional content with the meaning that is ascribed to it that we would say that is true or false. And if somebody else thinks that sentence means something else, well, then they'd just be incorrect. I mean,
no, but if we all agree, right?
If we all seem to agree, but ultimately we have, if I could go into your mind when you say epistemological skyhook, what you mean is hot fudge sundae. And if you're going into my mind when I say hot fudge sundae, what I actually mean is, I don't know, the Orient Express. It could be anything, right? And since we'd all have, but when I try to contemplate that relationship, that possible scenario, that sounds to me like rationality, that our cognitive faculties are not reliable. Well, it sounds to me like it would be, that would kind of almost play into Plantinga's, well, the whole argument, the whole epistemological skyhook. It would mean that none of us, we seem to be talking to each other, but we're really not. We seem to be reasoning, but we're really not.
So I don't, it doesn't seem to me that that's quite true, because if we all agree, right? Mm-hmm. If we are all, if it's not that I have an idea about something, what something means, and you have a different idea, we all have the same idea, but we're all wrong about the idea, right? Yeah. So it's not like we disagree with each other. It's that the world disagrees with us, right?
Right. Oh.
Then well, I guess my question is, how could we all be wrong, given that meaning is, at least to some extent, something created by minds in the first place?
I can imagine everyone believing something false. I mean, if we never discovered that that the Earth is not the center of the universe, and we kept believing that, and we believed that until the end of time, well, we'd still all be wrong, even though everyone agreed that was the truth. So I'm not comfortable making, because that sounds to me like it's making truth subjective rather than objective. And when you do that, I think that opens you up to the epistemological skyhook. It's because that can be seen as an argument against subjectivism. Because if subjectivism is true, then your subjectivism would apply to your own views on subjectivism.
No, I think you're right. Let me narrow that down for a moment, because that's definitely true. We could all be wrong about something. I'm sure there are many things that we're actually all wrong about, and we'll It's a
very interesting question. Yeah. Very interesting.
But what about so there's a question about having some kind of propositional belief and being wrong about that. But I'm thinking more about being wrong about what something is. So, I think we could all be wrong. Let's say we all think that the oldest tiger that ever lived was 110 years old. And actually, we have just never found out about this one tiger who lived to be 130. Okay, that's a case where we're just all wrong, and that's fine. But if in fact we all think that this thing that looks like a tiger is called a tiger, but it's not actually a tiger, we're all wrong. That's actually a piece of bacon, right?
Yeah.
There's a sense in which that seems to call into question, how could we be wrong about just what that is? We were the ones who identified the natural kind and named it in the first place.
Yeah. Or you could say, we thought Pluto was a planet, but then we redefined planet so that it's not a planet anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, it depends. I mean, what you call it. I mean, are you just calling it that word, or are you ascribing properties to it? Because if you're saying it's actually a slab of bacon, but you're saying it's a tiger and it has the stripes a tiger has, and it's alive and it has fur on it, which hopefully your bacon doesn't have fur on it. At that point, I think we would just be incorrect. It would be like, I mean, one example I heard was that if I said I have a toaster at home. Okay. Now, admittedly, it's an unusual toaster. It doesn't have some of the properties of toasters. It's not made out of metal or plastic. You don't plug it in. It's not electronic at all. It has the properties of mind, will, and emotion. And it gave birth to my 2 children. And then to top it all off, it doesn't actually make toast. Well, it could, but it would have to use another toaster to do it, right? Well, at that point, I'm not really talking about a toaster. I'm saying, well, it's still a toaster. No, you've taken the concept of a toaster, removed the properties that make it a toaster, endowed it with the properties of a human being, but you're still calling it a toaster. Well, no, it's not a toaster anymore. So it depends on how you're attributing the attributes, whether it has those properties or not. So, I mean, this is just my initial foray off the top of my head, because that's a really interesting question that we could get into. I mean, I'm going to be thinking about this for the next 2 weeks, man.
Yeah. And to be clear, I think, maybe I'm wrong, I think there's something more here than just switching the name, because otherwise you can just use the, the insights of, we can, assuming we're using rigid designators, right? We're not just flipping names around.
Right.
It still just seems to me that if what's actually, if what's actually a slab of bacon, we're all calling a tiger, then there's just something strange about, in what does the truth that we're missing consist, Right. That's kind of
it sounds a lot like Richard Rorty.
Yeah.
What you're saying sounds a lot like Richard Rorty, because that strikes me as what I've read of him. It strikes me as very similar to his position that the truth is not out there waiting for us to find it. It's something that we manufacture. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm very, my initial reaction is to disagree with that, but I have to sit down and think about it. Right. And I have young children, so I don't get to do that as much as I'd like.
Okay, so let's get back to Plantinga's specific argument. So one thing I wanted to ask you about, and you go into this I don't know if you go into this in detail in the book, but I know you go into it in the paper that you wrote. So there's you get to this loop, right? And you already alluded to this. Somebody could say, hey, well, if I can't trust my faculties, then I can't trust the part of the argument that took me to skepticism either. So I don't have to believe skepticism. So, hey, I got my cognitive faculties back. Right. And so you're not exactly you don't exactly land at skepticism and then get stuck there. Rather, you're in a sort of loop where you go from skepticism to believing in knowledge, back and forth.
Right.
And so somebody might say, well, why are you pretending that you get stuck in skepticism? Why can't you just, if you seem so comfortable getting stuck, leaving it at skepticism, why can't we leave it at doubting skepticism and trusting our faculties again? Right. How does Plantinga address that objection?
I'm not sure Plantinga does. I read a dissertation by a guy named Troy Nunley, and he addressed that on Plantinga's argument. And I think I like the way he put it. He said, because there was someone who objected, it's like trying to count to infinity, right? There's no non-arbitrary way of saying whether you could do that. If you could count to infinity, if you were to live forever, because in one sense, any final number you have, you could add to it, so you can't reach infinity. But then for any number, you can also say there's a specific time slot for them, given an infinite amount of time. So he argues that that's the same thing with this Humean loop, that you can't, why focus on the point with the skepticism, why not focus on the point when the skepticism refutes itself and gives you a reason to trust your reason again? Why not focus on that element? And what Nunley points out is that it's not the same, it's not really a parallel, because it's not just, Hume's loop is not just a continuation, it's a continuous circle. So it's like saying, can I count to infinity if I started all over again each time I reached the number 2? Well, no, you couldn't. So it's not an arbitrary thing like the counting to infinity thing allegedly is. So that's, I don't see why you would have to focus on either half separately why not focus on the whole argument? You have this loop, you see this loop. It is an undesirable cognitive state to be in, to see that you have this loop where you're stuck going around having a defeater for everything and then not having a defeater and then having it again. So avoid it. If you can avoid it, then avoid it. That's the rational response. I don't see why you have to focus on one part or another. Focus on the whole thing.
Right. So you don't have to focus on the skeptical part of the loop. You can just focus on the fact that you're stuck in a loop. And
right.
That is by itself enough to say, avoid getting here. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
In other words, avoid naturalism.
Yeah. Avoid whatever would lead to that kind of loop. Yeah.
One more question about this, and this can apply either to Plantinga or just to the argument in general. To what extent does certainty play a part in this? Because sometimes knowledge has a connotation of being a belief that you're sure about.
Right.
But yeah, to what extent does certainty play a part here?
Well, infallibilism was Descartes' goal. He was trying to find an infallible belief with his cogito. I think, therefore I am, and I can't doubt that. That's actually part of the strength of Plantinga's argument, is that he, coming at it from a naturalized epistemological position, he doesn't accept infallibilism. We're radically fallible, and we should expect to be radically fallible. And if you say, well, if you're a foundationalist, which he is, he's a foundationalist, but he's not an internalist foundationalist, a Cartesian foundationalist.
And by foundationalist, you mean
you have these foundational beliefs and you build up on them.
Mm-hmm.
And the challenge is, well, if the foundational beliefs are fallible, then anything you build up from there is fallible. So you don't have any fallible beliefs. Plantinga says, yeah, and you can have those fallible foundations can be defeated by other beliefs, and beliefs that are foundational in one context won't be foundational in another, and that's just how knowledge works. So he has no problem eschewing any kind of infallibilism. He's a firm fallibilist.
Would you then say that you could interpret Plantinga as saying so long as we reject naturalism, we are able to have rational beliefs and to feel confident in them, but we're not actually justified in feeling certain about any of them?
Well, feeling certain is different from the issue of infallibilism. I'm really confident about lots of things. But being a philosopher, the things I'm confident about are things that don't matter, and the things I'm completely unconfident in are things that everyone else takes for granted. But it's not a matter of how certain you feel. It's a matter of whether the beliefs themselves are really not questionable. And so that's why Descartes, he was questioning beliefs that he wasn't seriously saying we should question whether there's an external world. He wasn't seriously questioning whether he had a body or not. He even got to the point with the evil genie hypothesis. He said it's possible that my mathematical beliefs are wrong. I was like, that's crazy. Well, and he would say, yeah, of course it's crazy. I'm not saying that's really the case. I'm just trying to find this foundational belief that can't be doubted. Mathematical beliefs I can doubt. So I'm trying to see if there's something that is literally infallible. But he was, I'm sure he was certain throughout the entire exercise that 2 + 2 = 4. He was completely confident in that. I'd be shocked if he weren't. He was just, but so infallibilism and certainty are not the same thing. And that's, probably thank God for that. I think that would be a bad thing if they were the same thing, because then we'd be screwed. But planning is not necessarily suggesting we shouldn't be confident in our beliefs. He's just saying that our beliefs are fallible and we should recognize them as such. Now, having said that, he also says there's going to be some beliefs that would be really difficult to give up. He gives the example of, what does he call it? The case of the purloined letter, where someone in your office has a letter on their desk, but the letter is stolen. You have been known to steal such letters before. You had a motive for stealing this particular letter, and 2 of your colleagues say they saw you creep into that room and then walk out with something like looking like a letter in your hand. The only problem is that you remember taking a solitary walk in the woods at the time the letter was stolen. So the question is, should you base your belief of whether you are, should you base your belief that you're innocent on the evidence which would convict you? Or should you base it on your memories? I mean, bear in mind, the question isn't whether other people should base it on your memories.
Mm-hmm.
He says, it would probably be irrational for you to seriously say, oh, I must have committed the crime. He's like, well, no. I mean, you could make it more extreme even, but maybe when it gets more extreme, you could do that. But you remember walking through the woods, so you would know that you're innocent. And the fact that the evidence seems to point that you're guilty, so much the worse for the evidence. You know you're not guilty. So beliefs are fallible, but some beliefs are going to have a high level of confidence to them.
Yeah. I guess I was thinking more in terms of infallibilism, right? It sounds like Plantinga is open to the idea that even the most basic beliefs on which we build other beliefs, while we may be very confident and should be very confident,
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't mean that it's not possible that they could be open to doubt.
Right. Yeah. He'll just say, again, they're innocent until proven guilty. So it's perfectly rational and appropriate for me to accept them until I have a reason to think that they might not be true.
This is a bit of a digression again, but I am curious. Do you know why, or what has Plantinga said with regard to why his belief in God counts as such a basic idea?
Oh yeah, he's written a lot about that, and a lot of people have written against him like that. He's not saying that for other people necessarily, and he's not saying that because he says that his belief in God for him is properly basic, and for other people it can be properly basic as well. And
what is the criteria?
I don't need to defend it until I have a reason to think that it's not true. And a lot of Christian philosophers have taken issue with this.
What is the criterion for a belief being properly basic? Properly basic beliefs are the foundational ones, right? The sort of bottom level ones.
Well, sometimes, yeah. I mean, it could be something, yeah. So he just says, like memory beliefs are going to be properly basic, but of course they can be faulty. We all have faulty memories at some point. And sensory beliefs are usually, that's the foundation, but also we can have illusions and things like this. So he says that, well, if belief in God is I just find myself with this belief in the same way I find myself with my memory beliefs, and I find myself with my sensory beliefs, well, unless I have a reason to call it into question, I don't see any reason why I should call it into question. I can just accept it in this basic way. And critics have argued, and this is a good point, I think. Well, it's not a good point against his claims, but it's a good general point that couldn't other people have varying religious experiences and then just all say that they're properly basic? How do you adjudicate between all of these different religious experiences? And that's an interesting general point, but that's not what Plantinga is claiming. He's just saying, for me, it's perfectly rational for me to believe this experience is veridical unless I have some reason to doubt it. Now, you can bring all these divergent experiences in to try to make it into an argument as to why he should give that up. But he deals with that, and I think he's successful in saying that doesn't give me a reason to give it up. But it doesn't really say much as to how someone on the outside should in the marketplace for a worldview should adjudicate all these different properly basic religious experiences.
So then for him, the reason he has the belief in the first place, well, he doesn't need a reason, but where it comes from in the first place is something like religious experience?
For him, it doesn't seem to be. I mean, that's what I thought when I first was reading him, that's what I thought he was saying. That's you have this experience of God, and that's why you believe. But he contrasted more blatantly with his first book with belief in other minds. I don't have experience of other minds directly. I just find myself with that belief that other people have minds. and I don't really need to question it unless I have a reason to think that it's not real, unless it's not true.
And so this is something like that. He just sort of finds himself with the belief in God, and that's it.
That's how he puts it. Yeah, I mean, it's very strange to me because I would, the way you just said it, that it's grounded on religious experience. That's what I thought he was saying at first. But I don't think that's what he is saying. I think he's genuinely saying that it just seems true to me. In the same way that my belief that I had cornflakes for breakfast just seems true to me.
Right.
I mean, if you read Warren's Improper Function, in many ways, it's a phenomenological analysis of how all these different types of knowledge, what they're like. It can be read that way as a phenomenology of knowledge, not as a phenomenological justification of them, but just as a description of them. That's why it's very much naturalized epistemology. It's a description of all these various types of knowledge.
Makes sense. So I want to start moving away from Plantinga now. We've gone pretty deep into him, and that I like that. But one thing that I find can be kind of surprising about the Skyhook is that it can sometimes apply in places where you don't expect it to. So you open your book with two quick examples to sort of try to give a sense of what the argument is, and those are with Freudianism and Marxism. Can you run through those two quickly?
Right. Yeah, well, with Freudianism, the claim, and I want to qualify it as naive Freudianism and naive Marxism. But the claims would allegedly be that Freudian says that our beliefs are the product of childhood trauma and psychological dysfunction. And the Marxist says that our beliefs are produced by our class status and our role in society. Marx actually says that the only reason people disagree with me is because their class status requires them to. Something along those lines. But then the problem is if all of our beliefs are produced the way that Freudian or Marxist says, then their beliefs in Freudianism and Marxism are also produced that way. Since they're using that as a way to avoid claims to the contrary, when Marx says that the only reason you don't accept me is because your class status requires you to have the beliefs you have, it's like, well, if class status produces their beliefs, it's going to produce your beliefs in Marxism. And if class status obviates their beliefs as making them invalid in some way, then it would obviate your belief in Marxism too. That's the idea there. And that's not a me at all. That's a really common target. And when you look into this kind of literature, that people often see it first with Freudianism and Marxism. It's sometimes applied to limitative materialism specifically, or behaviorism. That's really common, stuff like that.
What do you know how supporters of Freudianism and Marxism respond to that criticism?
I haven't studied it, but I think they could probably pretty easily get around it by just saying not all beliefs are produced that way. We're just saying some beliefs are. Maybe religious beliefs are produced that way. Or they could just say, I mean, because it does seem kind of weird. Really, all of our beliefs are produced by childhood trauma. I had a moderately traumatic childhood, but I don't think all of my beliefs are produced by that. Right. There's got to be a few places where it doesn't touch.
Right. Because
so I think a more mature Freudian could easily get around that, and they could also question, okay, even if our beliefs are produced, that doesn't answer the question of whether the beliefs are reliable. That's a separate question, which is really what the naturalist and the determinist will say. They would happily say, yes, I believe in determinism, and so I believe our beliefs are determined as well. But they would challenge the further claim that therefore that invalidates them in some way. So there's at least two easy ways to avoid it.
That would be harder, I think, for the Freudian and the Marxist, though. I don't think that a Marxist would say that, would want to say that class dictates our beliefs, and it does so accurately. Right. Unless,
Yeah.
unless you have
Yeah,
to,
that's
like,
true.
only if you are in the exact class that I happen to be in, then you get the right beliefs.
Right. And it'd probably be better with the first objection, that not all of our beliefs are produced that way. I mean, your chess moves probably aren't determined by your class, your status, you know.
Right. So whatever happened to you when you were 3 years old is not why you think that you had cornflakes for breakfast, to cite the
Right.
example you've been using. Okay, that makes sense. What do you personally think is the strongest objection that you have found to the Skyhook argument in general?
Well, that's a big question. I would say issues that deal with possible forms of compatibilism. So determinist compatibilism, so that determinism is compatible with free will, or naturalistically, you could say that the natural processes are compatible with the rational processes of following an argument. That strikes me as being a very good point and something that needs to be addressed. I mean, in the final chapter, I give my version of the argument, and the reason I like my version is because I think it gets rid of those kinds of objections of compatibilism are irrelevant. It's not enough that you are doing what a rational agent would do. If you're not doing it for rational reasons, but for naturalistic reasons, then it doesn't count.
Okay, that makes sense. And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Next week, for part 2 of this episode, I'll continue my discussion with Jim Slagle. We'll discuss how theism, phenomenalism, and existentialism relate to the Skyhook argument. We'll talk about philosophers such as Descartes, Thomas Nagel, and Jürgen Habermas. We'll consider whether it is possible to simply accept radical skepticism. And finally, we'll talk about Jim's own history with religious experience. Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work, at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.